Have you ever wondered how the U.S. government paid its bills before the income tax? For most of American history, there was no IRS, no W-2 South, and no April 15th deadline. So where did the money come from? Today, we're rediving into the fascinating and often turbulent history of how the United States funded itself before 1913. It's a story of tariffs, whiskey, and a growing nation struggling to find its financial footing. Let's rewind the clock to the late 1700s. The brand new United States of America had just won its independence, but it was broke. The war left the nation with a mountain of debt, and the first government under the Articles of Confederation was powerless to raise money directly. States were supposed to contribute, but they rarely did. It was a financial mess. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton had a bold vision for a strong central government with the power to manage its own finances. He knew that for the new nation to be taken seriously on the world stage, it had to pay its debts. But how? The Constitution, ratified in 1788, gave Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. This was the game changer. Hamilton's plan relied heavily on two main sources of revenue: tariffs and excise taxes. Let's start with tariffs. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When a ship from Britain, for example, arrived in an American port loaded with textiles or tools, the government would charge a tax on those goods before they could be sold. This idea was brilliant for several reasons. First, it was relatively easy to collect. The government only needed to staff a few dozen ports of entry, rather than trying to tax every single citizen across a vast and sparsely populated country. Second, it was politically popular, at least in the North. These tariffs made imported goods more expensive, which gave a competitive advantage to America's young, developing industries. It was a form of protectionism, shielding American businesses from foreign competition. For over a century, tariffs were the lifeblood of the federal government. They consistently provided the majority of its revenue, sometimes accounting for over 90% of the total income. When you look at old government budget reports from the 19th century, you'll see tariffs listed as customs duties, and they are always the biggest number on the page. Think about that for a moment. Nearly every dollar the federal government spent on building the military, paying government salaries, and funding national projects came from taxes on goods shipped from other countries. The cost of running the government was passed on to consumers through the prices of imported products. If you bought a fine wool coat from England or a porcelain tea set from China, a portion of that price went directly to the U.S. Treasury. But tariffs alone weren't always enough, and they were also a constant source of political conflict. The industrial North loved high tariffs to protect its factories, but the agricultural South hated them. Southern states imported many manufactured goods and exported raw materials like cotton. High tariffs meant they paid more for the goods they needed, while their agricultural exports were often hit with retaliatory tariffs from other countries. This tension between North and South over tariff policy was a major contributing factor to the economic divisions that eventually led to the Civil War. So what was the second major source of revenue? Excise taxes. Unlike tariffs, which are taxes on foreign goods, excise taxes are levied on domestically produced goods. They are often called sin taxes because they are typically placed on products like alcohol and tobacco. Hamilton's most famous or infamous excise tax was the one he placed on whiskey in 1791. The idea was to raise additional revenue to pay off the war debt. But this tax was deeply unpopular, especially with farmers on the western frontier. For them, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a form of currency and an efficient way to get their grain crops to market. Turning corn into whiskey made it much easier and more profitable to transport over the Appalachian Mountains. These farmers felt the tax was unfair and targeted them specifically. They saw it as a power grab by a distant federal government, reminiscent of the British taxes they had just fought a war to escape. The anger boiled over into the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, where farmers in western Pennsylvania violently resisted the tax collectors. President George Washington, determined to assert the authority of the new federal government, personally led a militia of nearly 13,000 men to quell the uprising. The rebellion collapsed without a major battle, but the event was a crucial test. It proved that the federal government had the power and the will to enforce its laws, including its tax laws. Despite the initial resistance, excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco became a steady, if smaller, source of government income throughout the 19th century. They were a reliable supplement to the revenue generated by tariffs. For most of American history, if you weren't importing goods and you didn't drink or smoke, you likely paid very little in federal taxes. Another, less common, source of revenue was the sale of public land. As the United States expanded westward, it acquired vast territories. The government surveyed and sold off millions of acres to settlers, speculators, and railroad companies. The proceeds from these land sales provided a significant, though fluctuating, stream of income, especially during periods of major westward expansion in the 1830s. So, for over 120 years, this system of tariffs, excise taxes, and land sales was how the U.S. government operated. It was a system that funded the country's growth, paid for wars like the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, and kept the machinery of government running. However, this system had its limits. The revenue it generated was heavily dependent on the volume of international trade. During economic downturns or wars, when trade plummeted, government revenues would dry up, creating financial crises. The Civil War was the ultimate stress test. Funding the Union war effort was astronomically expensive. Tariffs and excise taxes couldn't even begin to cover the costs. To meet this unprecedented challenge, the Lincoln administration got creative. They issued massive amounts of government bonds, printed the first national paper currency known as greenbacks, and, for the first time in U.S. history, introduced a federal income tax in 1862. This first income tax was an emergency measure. It was a progressive tax, meaning higher earners paid a higher percentage of their income. It was a radical idea for its time, and it was explicitly temporary. The tax helped fund the Union victory, but it was highly controversial. Once the war was over and the immediate financial pressure was gone, the income tax was allowed to expire in 1872. The country went right back to relying on its old system of tariffs and excise taxes, but the world was changing. By the late 19th century, the United States was transforming from an agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. Massive fortunes were being built in railroads, steel, oil, and finance. Yet, under the existing tax system, these new industrial titans paid very little in federal taxes unless they consumed a lot of imported goods or alcohol. Meanwhile, farmers and working-class Americans felt squeezed. They saw tariffs as a tax that protected big corporations while raising the price of goods for everyone else. A populist movement began to grow, demanding a fairer tax system. They argued that the wealthiest Americans, who benefited the most from the new industrial economy, should contribute a larger share to the running of the country. The call for a new permanent income tax grew louder and louder. In 1894, Congress passed another income tax, but the Supreme Court struck it down the following year, ruling that a direct tax on income was unconstitutional unless it was apportioned among the states according to population, a logistical nightmare. This decision only fueled the fire for reform. Proponents of the income tax realized they couldn't just pass a law. They needed to change the Constitution itself. The political battle raged for years. Finally, in 1909, Congress passed the 16th Amendment, which gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states. It took another 4 years for the amendment to be ratified by the required number of states, but on February 3, 1913, it officially became part of the Constitution. This was the moment that forever changed the relationship between the American people and their government. The first income tax under the 16th Amendment was, by today's standards, incredibly modest. It only applied to the wealthiest Americans, less than 1% of the population. The top tax rate was a mere 7% on income over $500,000, which is equivalent to over $15 million today. But the foundation was laid. The era of funding the government primarily through tariffs was over, and the age of the income tax had begun. From a system built on taxing goods at the border, the United States transitioned to a system built on taxing the wealth and work of its citizens. This shift gave the federal government a far more stable and scalable source of revenue, enabling the massive expansion of its size and scope throughout the 20th century. So, the next time you look at your paycheck and see that line for federal income tax, you'll know the long and complex story of how we got here. It's a journey from the ports of the 18th century to the paychecks of the 21st, reflecting the incredible transformation of the United States itself. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. See you in the next video.